Welcome to JonGetsGames. With 43 votes in and winning by 5, today I'm going to be reviewing Compounded. This is a chemistry-themed game of trading elements, creating compounds, and exploding laboratories. First I'll go over the rules, then I'll do my review, and I'll end with 3 more games you can vote on for my next review. Alright, so how do we play Compounded? The first thing to note is there's a 4x4 grid of potential compounds that players will have access to create throughout the game. Each player also has a player board which not only shows them the current level of their 4 areas of study, but also is a nice area to hold the elements that they currently have available. Each turn has 4 different phases, and you evaluate all players in each phase separately. So we would have all players do phase 1, and then all players do phase 2, all players do phase 3, etc., etc. So let's explain those phases now. The first is Discovery, where each player is going to grab elements out of the bag equal to their current Discovery level, which at the beginning of the game is 2. Once all players have grabbed their elements, but before we go to the next phase, there is a free-for-all trading session. The first thing that can be traded are these elements themselves. You can trade 2 for 1, 1 to 1, but as you can see, there are varying numbers of them in this bag, so some are rarer than others. You can also trade these bonus chits, which are acquired through completing certain compounds out here, and trading non-binding verbal agreements. Once all trading has been done, we have to discard down to our holding desk size, which at the beginning of the game is 4. That's indicated by our lab statistic over here. So we discard down to 4, and now we can move on to the next phase. When we study, we take unused claim tokens and we put them out onto an empty compound that does not have one already. So I could put this one here, for instance. If I had more than one, I would place 1, and then other players would each place 1 around the table, and then I would have a chance to place another unused claim token. Once all unused tokens have been placed, players also have the ability to move one token that was already out on the board to a different compound. Now we research, and researching is where we take the elements from our desk and we put them out onto the player area. We can put them on compounds, and we can also put them on this fire extinguisher here. Once it gets 2 oxygen and a carbon, it flips over into a completed fire extinguisher, which I'll explain its use in just a little bit. So if we look over here and we see that our research level is currently at 3, that means I can take 3 elements from my desk and put them out onto the board like so. Remember, I could have split them up if I wanted to, but let's just say I put them over here. And I can also trade 3 of one element for 1 of a different element one time during my research phase. Once all players have put their elements out, we shift into the next phase, which is the lab. And this is essentially the cleanup phase. We go in player order, taking our compounds that have been completed. We take the elements off of them, we get our claim token back, we score victory points, and then we get to go up a area of study which is associated with that compound. So this is a liquid, so we could either go up once on discovery, because that's associated with liquid, or we could go up once in our laboratory, which is not associated with liquids, solids, or gases. Any of those 3 can bump up the lab instead. Now when you go up the lab, it gets you this little chit here which goes there, and now you can store 5 elements per turn instead of 4, which is quite nice. The other bonuses that you get from the liquids is you can go up discovery, and now you can draw 3 elements out of the bag instead of the original 2 at the beginning of your turn. If we had completed a solid, then we would go up on the solid track, and this would unlock a new claim token, so we could have a greater presence out on the board to claim various good compounds so that other players won't be able to get them. And finally, as we go up our research, which is associated with gas, we get to place more compounds from our board out onto the playing area quicker on each turn. Once all compounds have been acquired, and let's pretend like several more have, we are going to start drawing them from the compound deck. And at a certain point, we are going to get a lab fire. When we get the lab fire card, we are going to set it off to the side and continue to fill in all of the holes in our playing area. Only after we've filled all of them in do we evaluate this lab fire. And that just means that every element that has a little flame token on it is going to, or a flame icon on it, is going to get a flame token. As you can see, some compounds have 2 flame icons and some have 1. So in this instance, the ones that had 2, they're fine. 1 more flame token and they will explode. However, hydrogen sulfide over here only has a single, so it is going to explode now. Now let's pretend like it had already had a couple of different elements on it and maybe a claim token. When it exploded, the claim token is going to come back to the person who had it, and then the elements that were on it have to scatter out to an adjacent compound, which is orthogonal or diagonal. So if I'm red, I could take this hydrogen and move it, say, over here. Let's just pretend like I had a clay marker over here, so that would help me out. I could push this over here, and then the sulfur has no legal place to go, so it actually goes back to the bag. This hydrogen sulfide is going to go out of the game, and we would draw a new card. Now let's rewind just a little bit and pretend like we were already here, as we were before, and I had completed my fire extinguisher. This would be the perfect time to use it. If it had been completed, I would discard it from the game and prevent the placement of this one flame token. Now my hydrogen sulfide is safe, and I'm going to be able to probably complete it on my next turn and get lots of victory points. You may have noticed that there are these icons in the bottom right hand corner of some of these compounds. As I mentioned before, these can give you little bonus chips, which can be one-time use or permanent effects. You can trade these. I'm not going to go through the specifics of what all of those do. They can like light fires or steal the first player token, but one I do want to specifically mention is this right here. This is the journal, and you acquire it when you get to the second layer of solid study. You take this little chit here, you put it down here, and this is a really nice ability. This lets you, when you complete a compound, as you take the elements off, before you put them in the bag, you can take a single one of those elements from the completed compound, put it back into your desk, and then put the rest away. So that's a really powerful ability that's inherent to the study vial. The game is going to end from one of three different conditions. The first is if a player gets to the top spot on 3 out of their 4 areas of study. The second is if a player gets to 50 victory points. In either of those two cases, there will be one more turn played. The third case is if we go through all of the compound cards and we're not able to fill out this 4x4 grid, then the game is going to end immediately. There aren't really many endgame victory points in this game. There's really only 2. The first is if you've completed a fire extinguisher but you didn't actually use it to put out a fire, then that's going to be worth 4 extra victory points. And lastly is this wild element marker, which I didn't explain before. It's worth 2 victory points if you haven't used it at the end of the game, but during the research phase you can spend this to grab any element besides sulfur. The player with the most victory points, atomic points, wins the game. Before I jump into my review, I do want to show you the atomic point tracker for the game, or victory points. And it's a periodic table. You start at 0, when you have 1 victory point, you're at hydrogen. When you have 5 victory points, you're at boron. And you just keep cycling through the periodic table, which is pretty cool. It can occasionally be a little hard to tell who's ahead of who, but who cares? It's a periodic table. For my review of Compounded, I'm going to start with 3 positive points, then 3 neutral, 1 negative, some player count discussion, and finally my conclusion. So let's start with the positive. The first thing is I love this chemistry scientific theme that goes along with this game. It feels so fresh and different. You know, we're not building castles in Europe. We're not flying spaceships through space. We are constructing compounds with fundamental elements. It's scientifically accurate and interesting. We're chemists in a laboratory performing experiments. And I have nothing like that in my collection. And I love the way that makes me feel as I'm actually playing this game and pulling out these elements. This theme is what initially drew me to the game. Looking at the Kickstarter, I was just an instant backer. That looked so interesting to me, to be playing a chemistry-based game that also looked like it had some interesting mechanics going on. The second positive is I really like those 4 experimentation tracks on your player board. The ones that tell you how many elements to pull out of the bag or how many claim tokens you have to put out on the board. I really like that mechanic of specifically increasing the effectiveness of various actions inside a game. I actually created a prototype game about 4 years ago that just looked almost exactly the same with the 4 different tracks. And yeah, so that shows you how much I like it. It's really an interesting mechanic of wanting to not get too far ahead on any of these specific tracks. If you pull fistfuls of elements out of the bag but can only put 2 of them down, then that's not really going to increase the effectiveness and you're not really going to get ahead in that way. You would much rather be pulling less elements out of the bag but be able to put more on the board and have more claim tokens. Also maybe being able to keep more of them on your player board, so you really want it to stay even. But then again, you are limited by the compound options that are out in front of you, which ones are taken, which ones aren't taken. And it's just a very interesting decision to think, well, I really need a gas, so I'm going to claim that one even though it's really hard to get to, and I'll figure it out, I'll make it work. The third thing that I really like about this game is the art and component quality. I love the fact that we have a periodic table for our score track. I know that occasionally it can be a little hard to tell who's in front of who, but it's a periodic table. Who cares? You have to have this in a chemistry game. We've got all these compounds in the game, and the way the cards look, like this is the way that these elements actually line up in real life. They are scientifically accurate. Many of them show you the positive and negative ends of these compounds, and that has no in-game effect, but it's just cool because it's accurate. We've even got these test tubes to hold the player color tokens in the box. They spend their entire lives in the box. You don't use them in the game at all, but the publisher decided to go the extra step and put test tubes in a game about science and experimentation. I just think that is super cool. Moving on to the neutral points, the first one is potentially a groupthink problem, and that is that I found that there is a lot less trading to happen in this game than I thought. You know, potentially you can trade elements, you can trade these bonus chips, you can trade anything. You can say, I'll scratch your back if you give me 1 carbon. But in actuality, I found that very little trading actually happens when we play the game. And I think the main reason for that is it is a 100% open knowledge game. There is nothing hidden. You know exactly what elements your opponent has, you know what compounds they might be going for, what they can complete, and that definitely stifles the amount of potential trades that happen because you're not sitting there thinking, if I give them a calcium, will they be able to get that? I'm not sure. You know for a fact that they'll be able to get that, and now you're thinking, how much is it worth it to me to allow them to do that? And usually what ends up happening is the trading phase starts and we collectively agree that no one is trading, and then we move on. I'd say in a typical game, trades happen like maybe 3 or 4 times, and that's a lot less than I was expecting in this game. I really wanted more out of the trading mechanic, but I can't necessarily fault the game for that. That really might just be my and my friend's problem. The second neutral point is the way the lab fire mechanic mixes with the relatively high amount of flammable compounds in the game to create a slightly more chaotic game than I was expecting and maybe wanted to come out of the box. You know, mid to late game, when several compounds have been claimed and you're putting new compounds out, and then there's a lab fire, and so you put some more out and you put the flame tokens down, and then a couple compounds explode, and then you're putting more cards out. The game state can change quite rapidly, and those flammable cards, those flammable compounds, are quite a big risk to go in on. And it seems like in general you get more victory points and more bonuses for doing flammable ones, so there's risk versus reward. But especially with the compounds that only have 1 flame token, what ends up happening is people just never take those unless they have the option to grab it in 1 turn. And that's just not very interesting because oftentimes you have to have a very high research amount and the exact perfect elements to grab it in that 1 go. So usually those single flame token elements, they just get exploded pretty much immediately, and they never really get into circulation with the game. So I like the fire mechanic, I like the exploding mechanic, I think that's cool, the way the elements scatter around, but maybe just a little bit too much exploding and a little bit too much chaos for my taste. The third neutral point is the potential to have a runaway leader situation in this game. There was a big discussion on Board Game Geek where the designer weighed in and said essentially that trading is the main way that players can really gang up and hurt a runaway leader. They can trade amongst themselves and not trade with the leader. And I get that, and I can kind of see that happening, but I mentioned before that trading doesn't really happen that much in our games. And if the leader, the person who has the victory points, who has that really great experimentation levels to be doing really powerful actions, they're more likely to be drawing the correct elements, and they have the ability to place more elements out in the field because it's a bit rich gets richer. You get more compounds, which increase your abilities, which allow you to get more compounds, and rarely do people actually get to stop that person. There's no way to stick a wrench in the spokes of someone who's really doing very well. That being said, it's not been a plague on this game. It's happened once or twice, and it was a little bit of a bummer, but I could see it potentially being an ongoing issue, but it's not that big of a deal. And now for my single negative with this game, and that has to do with the fact that player order is really important in this game, and there is almost nothing that you can do to change it. There are a couple compounds which will let you steal the first player token, but they're pretty rare. In general, the first player token just moves clockwise around the table, but going first or being near the beginning of player order is really important to claim specific compounds that you really need for your engine that you might be lacking. And I feel like this was a definite missed opportunity to potentially stop runaway leaders, or more importantly, help fall behind losers in this game. If maybe the people who are doing the worst least victory points, or maybe the worst experimentation track setting, maybe those people got to go first because they now have the ability to get back into the game potentially And that person who has an amazing engine, well, they are now going to be a little bit hampered by the fact that they're not getting the potentially first dibs. They might be getting last dibs, they might be getting first dibs. It depends on where that turn order token happens to be. So sometimes when you're playing the game, you're thinking about, okay, I'll be first player in 2 turns, and so I'm going to want to do this and that. But the game state, like I said, can change so fast that it's hard to plan for that as well. So I really wish there was a better, more integrated mechanic for changing the player turn order, and I just think that was a missed opportunity. So now let's talk about player count. The box says it plays 2 to 5 players, and I've played it in most of those settings. So let's start with 2 players. In a 2-player game, there is actually a dummy player who is controlled by whoever is the start player on that turn. The dummy player generates elements and can put elements out on the board, and it actually works pretty well. Trading is almost non-existent between the 2 players because it's pretty zero-sum, but you can trade 1 element with that dummy player, which is a pretty interesting mechanic. So 2-player worked. 3 and 4-player games also worked pretty well. I feel like that's kind of where the game was built to be at. The game progressed well, and there was definitely some chaos, but not too much. And shifting into 5-player, I played 1 5-player game, and oh my gosh, too chaotic for me. I mean, I would play it again 5-player if someone twisted my arm, but I don't think it's the sweet spot for this game. There are so many people vying for these compounds and so many compounds being completed that it's very chaotic. It exacerbates those chaos potential neutral issues that I had earlier. So you could do 5 if you want, but I think 4 is probably best, and 2 worked better than I was expecting. In conclusion, I've played Compounded 4 times now, and I like it, but I don't love it. I was expecting to stay more excited about continuing to play it than what actually ended up happening. When the Kickstarter first came out, I was so excited. It had this awesome chemistry theme where you're trading elements and you're doing engine building and compounds are exploding, and I just was so excited I had to have it, and I got it. My expectations were really high, and I got my friends together and we played it, and I enjoyed it, but I remember feeling like, oh, I'm not as excited as I thought I was going to be, and that's probably my fault. I had too high expectations. And every time I played it subsequently, I have enjoyed myself, but I never really had that blood-pumping, excited, hold-your-breath moment in the game, and many other games give that to me, so I think it's been a little bit overshadowed by other stuff that I've been playing instead. That does not mean that this game is bad. I will continue to own it. I will continue to play it. My girlfriend Jess really enjoys it, and I think that people who think that science is cool will also be very attracted to this game. And especially maybe teenagers or older children, I think it would very much work in that kind of setting where you've got great mechanics and awesome theme integration with lots of highly scientifically accurate stuff to just really get people into that sciencey mood. If this sounds interesting to you, then I recommend you give this game a shot. It's time to find out which game you want me to review next. I've got Valley of the Kings, Mundus Novus, and Splendor. If you look right below the video, there's a quick link. It'll take 10 seconds to vote, and if you want, please subscribe to my channel and you'll get to see which one of these games wins. Thanks for watching.